Boardroom Bound, Episode 18, Why the Corporate Secretary is Your Best Friend with Doug Chia.
Nowadays, the corporate secretary effectively serves as a liaison between management and the board.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. In today's show, we'll be speaking with Doug Chia, who is the Executive Director of the Conference Board's Governance Center. Previously, he served as Assistant General Counsel and Corporate Secretary for Johnson & Johnson. And before J&J, he served as Assistant General Counsel Corporate for Tyco International. He's also practiced law at several of the leading firms. He has served as Chair of the Board of Directors of the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals, President of the Stockholder Relations Society of New York, member of the Corporate Laws Committee of the American Bar Association, and a member of the New York Stock Exchange Corporate Governance Commission. In today's show, Doug is going to be describing several key trends and activities that are happening for us in the boardroom, what he is seeing and experiencing from the members of their group, and that's because he has a unique perspective since they meet in quiet seclusion of, say, 25-member panels behind closed doors in Chatham House rules where they can have true discussions. They can actually dig into the meaty, gritty topics of today and learn from each other in a way that you'd never be able to do in a large public forum. And he'll be giving us those insights of what they're seeing and the topics that their members are wrestling with are relevant for all of us as we think about how to position ourselves for the board roles. He's also then going to be talking about his experience being a corporate secretary. And in most of the public companies, the corporate secretary is the face-off point for the boards, not only to management, but also to investors and stakeholders and shareholders. The corporate secretary has an essential role. It varies a little bit by company. Doug's going to peel that back, what it looks like, the roles and responsibilities, and how you as a director can best work with that key person in the company, your corporate secretary. So much great knowledge to share today. Let's jump into the show. Doug Chia, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you, Alex.
Delighted to have you on the show today and to be talking about the way that your organization, the Conference Board, is engaging with so many different related stakeholders to the boardroom, not just the directors themselves, but the companies, the C-suite. And I think we'll be able to talk about the different perspectives and how all those come together because it's a busy and complex role that directors are trying to solve today.
Absolutely.
And maybe we could just start, if you'd love to give us a bit more context about the Conference Board Governance Center and how you guys work with these different stakeholder groups.
Sure. Well, the Conference Board is a 100-plus-year-old think tank. Our members are mostly large corporations and universities and hospital systems. And we don't do any advocacy work, pure objective research and peer-to-peer convenings. The Governance Center is a subset of the Conference Board. Within the Conference Board, we have our own subset of members, and this is for companies that really understand the strategic importance of corporate governance and want to dedicate resources to that and have their folks come and talk in small private settings with the key opinion leaders to find industry solutions to today's governance issues.
And I would just love to explore this a little bit more for our members because if some of them are aspiring directors, for example, so they've not sat behind those closed doors and know what it's like and how important it is. So maybe we can just give a little context. So when you're in the boardroom and the pressure is on to make key decisions, sometimes you feel like you can't ask those simple, knotty questions of why are we doing this? How are we going about it? And it can be really helpful to have the environment where you're sitting around with peers from different industries, different companies, but also wrestling with the same topic. So let's say you're on the compensation committee and you're thinking about what's the best practice, how do I go about that? It's a safe place to explore. Can you give some more color around that?
Yeah, I think that the people who come to discuss these issues with us, they're from different stakeholder groups, and because these are smaller and Chatham House rules settings, we have like a kind of 25 to 35 person roundtable. In that setting, and speaking at length for a couple hours, you're really developing relationships with these people. And in that setting, people tend to let down their guard a little bit or put away their standard bullet points and talking points and be willing to talk about solutions that maybe they wouldn't talk about in a large public conference setting. And so that's where you can ask these questions and get more thoughtful answers and really understand some of the nuances around these types of topics from the viewpoint of different stakeholders, and with the stakeholders sincerely wanting to learn from you. And I think that really, if you can take that back to the boardroom, you come with a higher level of sophistication on governance issues.
And I think that's very well said on the educational piece. I think everyone listening would be able to wrap their head around, oh, this is great. I would learn how other people have done it, gone through it, and what I can bring back to myself. And on the show, we talk a lot about networking as well. And maybe you can talk a bit about that, because I imagine for a lot of people, especially if you get that breakthrough and get your first, say, public company board role, it might become a bit easier, but it's still about the networking. Do you have any insights into, maybe this is almost plugging the conference board, about how successful you are about bringing people together, sharing ideas, and expanding networks?
Absolutely. The peer-to-peer convening is a key part of what we do. There are a lot of organizations out there dedicated to corporate governance, but a lot of them focus on the large conference format, where you're going to a conference and you're meeting potentially, a couple hundred people there, and you're in rooms where it's people on stage and then audience. And that's incredibly valuable for educational purposes, but for networking it's very difficult because there's so many people you want to meet, and you only have, the coffee break or something like that to meet them. And then you say, well, we'll have lunch next time you're in my city.
Right.
And then, but so at our events, you're in the room with these people for, a few hours and talking about particular issues at length. And that's where you really develop a strong relationship, and you can understand each other. And you might not meet hundreds of people, but you will meet some of the key people that you wouldn't otherwise have a chance to sit down with and talk about in very frank terms. So we see a lot of people, who meet at our events and connect later on, and it serves both of their whatever institutions they're representing. It serves them well to have that relationship.
And I think that's very well said. I'm remembering one of the prior episodes we had with Steve Bartlett back on episode 2 at the very beginning, where he talked about every board that he is on, he insists that they have an executive session both at the beginning and at the end of their meetings. So it allows them to cover, for example, if they need to have a conversation about the CEO and their performance, they've got that sort of safe space, closed space to do it. This, to me, in my mind, is another extension of that, of I can bring those ideas and best practice to someone else, put them on a wall, see if they stick, and get that feedback. So invaluable for me. And I imagine it also means you can get into a lot of the stickier, thornier subjects that we're seeing today, which are so hard to break down within the confines of a board. So good governance, maybe it's just a big, large bucket to talk about. I know you guys spend a lot of time on that. Can you give us some ideas about how you're working through that and some of the best practices that you're seeing come out?
Well, what we're really working on is getting people to think about the job of the director, and obviously the job of the director is governance. And, it's really what it all boils down to, what happens in that room. And so, thinking about the job, when someone is asked to go on a board, they're not really handed a job description. And there is no, legal or statutory job description for a director. It's something that's just evolved over time. And so you ask people what the definition is, and everyone's going to have a different definition. Right. an expectation, an assumption of what goes on in that room. And so part of what we're trying to do is move everyone to some kind of similar set of principles around, what is a board member supposed to be doing and what are they not supposed to be doing? Because, certain stakeholders have unreasonable expectations for boards, and certain board members are really out of touch with what the modern board member ought to be doing, and is not really informed about that, and therefore has no idea the kind of responsibility that people are placing on this person.
And that changes company by company, a little bit industry by industry. So, for example, my prior roles at J.P. Morgan, if you are one of the board members there, which is one of the biggest, most high-profile, most complex businesses in the world, versus, say, a smaller, newer public company, perhaps just IPO in the tech space, something like that. Different norms, different ideas, different styles. And I imagine you're probably trying to give people best practices that range across those, but also figuring out how to tailor it to themselves. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think for us, I think there's other organizations that really focus on kind of technical practices. What we focus on is kind of the way of thinking, the way of approaching corporate governance and your role as a director. So yes, it's going to be different depending on what type of company you're going to, but that gives you the opportunity to step back and say, okay, what should I be doing? What type of governance does this company require, and how can I best add value to that? And so for a large multinational, well-developed company, it's going to be a totally different approach in terms of how you look at that company and how it's run, as opposed to a smaller tech company that's still struggling for financing and really just hasn't got, still trying to get its sea legs. And for that company, they need certain things from directors that a J.P. Morgan really doesn't.
Right.
And so, thinking about it that way in terms of, here's what you're getting into, as opposed to, oh, I'm just going to go be a director, whatever that means.
Right. Well, let's break that down even a little bit more for our audience, because many of the people here are aspiring directors. I was on the phone the other day with someone who runs a very successful private company, and he was telling me, I'm now excited to be pursuing my first public board company role. And I know his specific niche and his expertise in the marketing space and social media, so he will get there, right? Because that's in high demand. And if you were talking to this individual or other people in our audience, you're saying, generally, at a top tier, Fortune 50 company, a place like a J.P. Morgan, if you were to lay out for us, here are the key things you make sure you do, and here's the key things actually you shouldn't be doing, here's why. How would you explain that?
It's a tough one. I think, to start with, you have to know what you're getting yourself into, and that entails really understanding the company beforehand. Do your due diligence and understand what the company's going through and what their future challenges are. But it's also understanding the expectations of the job that are set by other people, over which you really have no control. And, you have to decide, is that job for you? And once you do that, other things should fall into place in terms of what you're supposed to be doing there. You'll get a sense from the other board members. You'll get a sense from the CEO. I think, insisting on very rigorous orientation. The company will provide you with basic orientation, but it's a good idea to go deeper and say, okay, you're setting me up to have meetings with all these folks. Here are a couple other folks I'd also like to meet with so I can understand certain things better. Really always be challenging without being intrusive. So obviously that's a delicate balance, and I think that's a lot of what the debate today over board, the role of the board is, in terms of where do you draw that line between, very inquisitive to intrusive and disruptive?
And I think you just gave me my tweet for the day. ABC has always been closing in my mind when I think about most people, but always be challenging. I think that's a great perspective for a director in a careful, constructive way, but I like that.
Absolutely.
And when we think about the world of a public company board director, especially the big sort of companies we were just talking about, the expectations are heightened almost to levels of misunderstanding and inability to handle it. There's so much on a director's plate at these large public companies, and that's obviously a topic that you're helping people wrestle with today. How does someone begin to wrap their mind around that?
Really, it's reading, talking to people, studying up. Talk to people with experience. There are people out there with a lot of board experience. And they are troves of knowledge, and a lot of them they want to share because they want to see people succeed and they want to see companies succeed. Read, there are several books out there right now that are talking about major governance failures that everybody knows about. Take a look at those books. Obviously, they're not first-hand accounts. But they give you an idea of some of the issues that might crop up at the company that you're going to be a board member of. And you also have to think about, okay, here's what being a board member would be like for this company in good times, which is presumably when you're joining. Mm-hmm. But let's think about some of the, more challenging times that this company could go through, or the more challenging situations in terms of, depending on the industry, what kind of a PR crisis could crop up, what kind of a regulatory crisis could crop up. And you got to think about the good and the bad before you go in, because when the bad happens, you're going to be blamed, whether you think it's your fault or not, whether you think it could have been prevented or not, you're going to get blamed.
I think that's a good point. And also, even you were just talking about due diligence before, understanding whether you're walking to an active situation, not necessarily a future problem, knowing whether there's any litigation going now, because as soon as you're on the board, you're part of it, even if it happened before you.
Yeah. Now, some directors, they're going to be chosen because of those situations. Mm-hmm. If the company's in the midst of a turnaround, or there's going to be some kind of a major leadership succession, or the company is really in the thick of a major legal proceeding, they're going to go out and get certain types of directors, and you might be one of those. And so you just have to understand, another big part of being a board member, or being chosen to be a board member for anybody, is why me? Why are they reaching out to me? What is it that I have that they're expecting to get? And you should be asking that question, as opposed to, it's really an honor to join the board and to be asked. It is, but there's a reason they're going after you, and that will really inform you in terms of what the role is going to be once you get there.
I think that's a wonderful spin on the way most people probably consider boards in terms of the interview process, and as if you're finding a job, is it a good fit, but also remembering to back of their mind they're hiring you for specific skill set and reason. One example comes to mind me is Cheryl Belcher, who turned around Kentucky's Louisiana Fried Chicken, and she was on the board of Pier 1, and then the CEO was quickly departed. She stepped in on an interim basis to fill that in, literally probably a few hours before an investor call that happened, and she was ready and prepared for it. So the board is clearly planning out in their competency matrix who has what skill sets, what abilities to cover in times of need. So that was a prepared board. I think that's a good example of what you're talking about.
Well, that's also an example of how today the selection of board members and how people do board composition is very different from what it was before. Obviously there's still companies out there that they say, well, let's get this person on the board just because, he's a good guy to have around, he's really smart, he really knows a lot of people. That's not really the way it's done anymore. People are mapping out, like you said, some kind of a skills matrix, or looking at, what kind of thing do we need to address where we really don't have that type of person with a certain background on the board. And so board members need to understand that when they're assembling a board, it's very purposeful. It's very, or at least it should be very deliberate.
No, that makes absolute sense. And I would also love to educate our listeners today on some of your background, your experience, because it's highly relevant to the board, and it's not something that we've covered in a previous topic. So you're a lawyer by training, and you've had great experience at some of the top firms, and you've been a corporate secretary for both Johnson & Johnson, and you also played some of that role in prior life when you were over at Tyco and your general counsel. I would love to hear some of the information and experiences that you've had in that role. Clearly, lots of interactions with the board. How does a board work with a corporate secretary? What are the best practices in that regard?
Well, the board, or I guess the relationship between the corporate secretary and the board is an important one that oftentimes gets overlooked. The corporate secretary used to be seen as more of a scribe and someone who works on logistics of board meetings. Nowadays, the corporate secretary effectively serves as a liaison between management and the board, and also shareholders and the board. And so once you understand that the corporate secretary plays that role, you can use that person to get all kinds of information. It can be your first port of call when you're looking for a piece of information, because the corporate secretary is a great connector. If you ask them, look, I'd like to see kind of the company's reports about this, the corporate secretary will know who to call in the organization to get that. And so, using that person as a one-stop shopping type person is really important. Also, the corporate secretary is very in touch with shareholders these days. It's another thing that resulted from kind of the evolution of that role, and getting kind of the sense of the pulse of what the shareholders are thinking. What are the latest trends? What are things that might be coming down the pike? What is the hot governance practice that everybody's talking about that might not have hit our company, but probably will, and we need to understand it before it gets here.
Right. We should learn from others, not have to repeat the mistakes ourselves. That makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely.
And in terms of our audience, right, so some of them are aspiring directors, other are new directors, perhaps in their first 5 years, thinking about how do I do this better? Some might be aspiring to have a portfolio of board roles. Can you give us a sense, and you don't have to necessarily draw upon your experience, it could just be best practices here, but the ways when boards have worked with you as a corporate secretary, it's been most efficient and effective, and what you would recommend if you were moving into a new corporate secretary role, the way you would want to run it. How would you recommend board people do that?
I think it's about relationships and having a common understanding of, here's what the secretary can do for you. The corporate secretary is going to be different in different companies, and part of that will depend on the person, part of it will depend on the culture. So, in certain companies, the corporate secretary might not play as big a role. In other companies, the corporate secretary could be someone who is very close to the CEO and heavily involved in meetings that where people are discussing strategy. But I think that developing a good working relationship in terms of basic things like how to communicate with the secretary, explain to them how you as a director like to be communicated with, because all kinds of situations are going to come up, and you're going to need to be in contact with them. They're going to need to be in contact with you, and you want to make sure that's efficient, and you want to make sure that the corporate secretary knows what your pet peeves are. If your pet peeve is getting some kind of a Saturday delivery via courier that you just can't stand that, then they should know that. Don't ever call my cell phone. Instead, please email me. Or I only correspond by text, so don't ever, email. I'll never read it. Those kind of things are important at the end of the day, especially when there's a situation where you need to get people right away.
We're laughing, but they are essential, right? Because people are incredibly busy who are working on boards, and they have their own personal styles, and helping them help you to get what you need done makes a lot of sense. I think that's great advice.
Yeah, and the corporate secretary is the one who needs to know about each board member and their particularities in terms of the who likes the rose sitting on the bed when they get into the hotel room, so to speak. You get to know these people as people, and oftentimes you get to know their spouses and their families, and so it's a relationship that you build over the long term.
Well, Doug, we've talked about a lot of best practices today, not only in terms of the corporate secretary interaction with the board, but tackling some of the bigger issues. As we think about not only where we are today and trying to solve some of these, if we look down the line, and perhaps this is some official views that the Corporate Board Governance Center is having, what do you think of the future of the boardroom? What would you be talking about?
The future of the boardroom, there's going to be more and more people who want to get in. And get some kind of a view. So you have more people who are insisting on meeting directly with board members, which is a new thing. And you also have more and more calls for disclosure about what goes on in the boardroom, what the board reviews, also things that really were not happening in the past. Corporate disclosures were very much about company performance, performance of the executives. But now people want to know, what types of reports go to the board? Who does them? Sometimes they say, can you give us a summary of what the conclusions were when the board, when management reviewed a certain topic with the board? And there's going to be more and more of that. Obviously, there will be pushback from the corporate world, but again, there's the expectations are often more relevant than what the legal and regulatory requirements are.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And what parting advice would you have for new or aspiring board members who'd be listening to you today, Doug?
Say, know what you're getting into. Really understand how the role of the board member has evolved. There are guidebooks on this. Just pick any one of them up, a current one, and then talk to other board members, people who have been on boards. And if you're going on a board, interview that board. Don't just say, okay, I'll join the board. Sounds good. You're going to want to meet some of the people on that board. And if they're not interested in meeting you, to me, that's a red flag. Like, they're bringing me on to this pretty important position, and only one person is meeting with me, and it doesn't seem like they're meeting with me for very long. The other board members are just taking that person's word for it. To me, it seems like that's, I would want to do more due diligence about me if I were them. So really look for those kind of signs that the board is going to be taking its job seriously.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And Doug, I'm a firm believer that all leaders are readers, and I know our audience are a bunch of readers. You've talked about a few different categories of books they might read. Is there one or two that stands out in your mind that are, must have, picked up, be read, and digested?
There are a couple. Right now, I have on my shelf a book called Bad Blood by John Carreyrou, and this is all about Theranos and the breakdowns there, and a lot of them were governance related. Now, that's a recent situation, or relatively recent. The one that really got me going was Disney War by James B. Stewart, and this was about everything that led to kind of the Michael Ovitz the Michael Ovitz hiring and departure, and all of the governance bad practices and breakdowns around that, which eventually ended up in Delaware court. And I read that book and was fascinated by kind of the boardroom drama. But also I went and read the Delaware decisions from the Disney case, and reading about how the Delaware judges and chancellors looked at what happened there is fascinating. And it's very readable. For court decisions, the Delaware judges and chancellors, they write very clearly in a way that a business person can really understand. To me, those are the director, I think, really earned their stripes when things go sideways. There's not a lot they can do to prevent things, but when there's a crisis, the good boards know how to jump in and get on top of things and help stabilize the ship. And in some cases, you can see there was a crisis and the board didn't do its job. They didn't do their job. They fell down on the job, which led to an even worse situation.
Well, I think that's a great summary of an understanding about the job is not always easy, and there are a lot of key responsibilities, which is why you're trying to find the right person for the right role, for the right organization. And I feel like you've given us so much education here today, and it's wonderful to have you, Doug, as part of the show and being on the Boardroom Bound podcast. Now, what would be the best way for our audience to follow up and connect with you if they would like to do that?
Well, I am on Twitter, so my Twitter handle is @ Doug Chia, DougChia. I'm also on LinkedIn, and if anybody wants to connect with me on those two platforms, happy to do so. And my current email address at the conference board is douglas.chia@conferenceboard.org. So I think I'm pretty easy to find, and I'm always willing to talk.
Very good, and I will make sure we put those in the show notes. And we were delighted to have you on the show today, Doug. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be more boardroom bound.
Alex, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Doug Chia. And this is the first time that we've dug into the corporate secretary role in this podcast. And it's wonderful for all of us to get the insights of someone who's been in that role for multiple companies to be able to share what it actually is like interfacing with the board. The corporate secretary is the most essential person, apart from the CEO, in the sense of that's who you're facing off with. That's your point of contact to management. That's your point of contact to investors, to shareholders, to stakeholders. They, in some ways, are your best friend, your most trusted contact. They're supposed to know who you are and how you like to receive communication. I appreciate Doug peeling back that onion for us and showing us what it's like on the inside and how well that can work. Now remember to head over to podcast.gordon.edu, where you can get links to all of today's resources that were discussed in the show, including several books that Doug highly recommends. If you enjoyed this episode or any other episode of the podcast, I would so appreciate it if you would open iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or wherever you're listening to this and take 30 seconds to leave a rating and review. This helps to get word out about the show. Stay subscribed and tune in every week because we're working hard to get top quality content out for you. So thanks for joining me on this episode of the show. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.